My family betrayed me to protect my brother's $30,000 debt. Here's how I fought back and found freedom, and then. My childhood in suburban Chicago always looked perfect from the outside. A neat house on a quiet cul-de-sac, 2 working parents, and a younger brother everyone adored. But behind that polished exterior lay a harsh reality that shaped who I am today. From the time I could understand words, I knew my role in the family. I was the dependable one, the one who had to strive, achieve, and set the example for my younger brother, Jake. He, on the other hand, was the golden child who could do no wrong. Jake is 7 years younger than me. That difference alone meant I was never just a sibling. I was a stand-in third parent. By the time I was 12, I was babysitting him daily, even during my school breaks, while my mom and dad worked. I didn't mind at first. He was a cute little kid who followed me everywhere. But as we got older, the disparity in how we were treated became impossible to ignore. When I was 17 and Jake was 10, the contrast between us was glaring. I remember one night, sitting at the dining room table with my chemistry textbook open, trying to figure out a tough equation. I had just gotten a B- on a test, the first time I'd gotten less than an A. My parents' reaction? They grounded me for a month. A whole month for one B-. That same week, Jake had been caught stealing $20 from my dad's wallet for the second time. Dad scolded him lightly, saying, "Jake, you know better than that. No grounding, no punishment. Just a warning." When I asked why Jake wasn't punished the way I was, my mom replied, "He's young, Melissa. You're older. You should know better. Besides, Jake's sensitive. We don't want to push him too hard." It wasn't just discipline where the favoritism showed. My parents poured every ounce of emotional energy into Jake's happiness while assuming I could fend for myself. When I brought home straight A's, the only response I got was, "Good, but you could still do better in calculus." When I graduated as valedictorian of my high school class, my mom's immediate reaction wasn't pride. It was concern. "I hope this doesn't make Jake feel bad about his grades," she said, as though I had done something wrong by excelling. Meanwhile, Jake skated through life. He barely passed his classes, spending most of his time in the basement playing video games. If he missed school, it was fine. He needed a break from the pressure. By the time he turned 16, he had dropped out of most extracurriculars, claiming he didn't have the energy for them. My parents didn't push him. Instead, they coddled him, repeating their favorite phrase, "Not everyone's like you, Melissa." That double standard only grew worse as we entered adulthood. When I turned 18, I was eager to move out. I had worked at a diner for 2 years and saved every penny I could, enough to pay for a bus ticket to New York and the first few months of rent for a shoebox-sized apartment I'd share with a college roommate. The day I told my dad I was leaving, he shrugged and said, "Good. You'd need to start paying rent if you stayed anyway." That hurt, but I brushed it off. I put myself through college, working 2 jobs while juggling classes, and eating ramen more nights than I care to remember. Meanwhile, Jake stayed home. He started at a community college but dropped out after 1 semester, claiming it was too stressful. My parents' response? They gave him an allowance so he could figure things out. He spent the next 5 years living at home, occasionally picking up a part-time job that he'd quit after a month or 2, always blaming the manager or the work environment for being toxic. When I graduated with honors and got my first entry-level job in software engineering, I thought I'd finally proven myself. But even then, my parents couldn't muster much enthusiasm. My dad's only comment was, "Must be nice to finally have some job security." My mom? She asked if I'd help Jake pay for his rent since he was still finding himself. It was as if nothing I did mattered unless it somehow benefited Jake. Through it all, I tried to stay the course. I built my career brick by brick, moving from entry-level to mid-management at a major tech company. I saved for a house, bought a car, and invested in my future. Every success was the result of hard work, sleepless nights, and sacrifices. And yet, no matter how much I accomplished, my family acted as though it was only possible because of their sacrifices, as if they deserved credit for my independence while they continued enabling Jake's irresponsibility. The resentment built slowly, like water behind a dam. Each unfair comment, each instance of favoritism, each dismissal of my efforts added to the weight. Over time, I began to see my family less and less. Phone calls were rare, and visits home felt more like obligations than reunions. I wasn't bitter, at least, I told myself I wasn't. I just didn't see the point of engaging with people who saw me as a resource instead of a person. Still, part of me held out hope. Maybe one day, my parents would see how much their actions had hurt me. Maybe Jake would grow up and take responsibility for himself. Maybe we could be a family again. But those hopes dimmed with every passing year, and by the time I turned 36, I knew better. My role had always been clear. I was the safety net, the problem solver, the one who was supposed to step in when Jake's life fell apart. And Jake? He was the golden boy, shielded from consequences, always expecting someone else to clean up his messes. I had accepted it for years. But as I would soon find out, even a safety net has its breaking point. Leaving home was both terrifying and liberating. At 19, I arrived in New York City with 2 suitcases, a couple $100s, and a stubborn determination to succeed. I shared a tiny apartment with a college roommate I found through an online forum. The place was barely big enough for the 2 of us, and we could hear the constant hum of traffic through the paper-thin walls. But it was mine, and for the first time, I felt free. While Jake remained at home in Chicago, living rent-free and playing video games in the basement, I was working double shifts at a diner to afford tuition at a state university. During the day, I juggled classes and studied in the campus library until closing time. At night, I waited tables, earning just enough in tips to keep the lights on and pay for instant noodles. I didn't resent the hard work. If anything, I was proud of it. Every dollar I earned, every grade I fought for, was proof that I could make it on my own. Jake, on the other hand, was on a very different trajectory. He enrolled in a local community college at my parents' urging, but within a few months, he dropped out. He said the classes were too overwhelming, the professors were too strict, and the coursework wasn't his thing. My parents' reaction was what I had come to expect. They didn't push him to go back or suggest he find a job. Instead, they gave him an allowance and encouraged him to take time to figure himself out. Every time I called home, I heard the same story. Jake was still looking for his passion. Jake was under a lot of stress. Jake wasn't like me. My mom liked to remind me of that whenever I asked why they kept enabling him. "You've always been so independent, Melissa. You don't need our help." "Jake does," she'd say. By the time I graduated with honors, I had accumulated more student debt than I care to remember. But I also had a job offer waiting for me at a small tech firm in Seattle. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. I packed my bags and moved across the country, ready to build a life on my terms. Meanwhile, Jake turned 21 and still hadn't held down a job for more than a few weeks. My parents continued to support him financially, paying for his rent when he eventually moved out of their house and into an apartment downtown. Their generosity extended to Jake in ways that still astonished me. They helped him buy a car when he complained about public transportation being too unreliable. They paid for his groceries when he said he was too busy to cook. They even covered the costs of his short-lived business venture, which turned out to be nothing more than a pyramid scheme he got sucked into by a friend. When I asked why they didn't let him face the consequences of his choices, my dad's answer was as dismissive as ever. "He's young. He'll figure it out. Not everyone can be like you." That phrase haunted me. Not everyone can be like you. It was their excuse for everything. Jake could flounder through life without direction because he wasn't like me. He could waste money and quit jobs because he wasn't like me. It wasn't his fault. It was mine. I had set the bar too high, and they didn't want to pressure him to reach it. Over the years, their favoritism began to weigh on me more than I wanted to admit. Every time they asked me to chip in for Jake's latest crisis, I swallowed my frustration and helped. When he needed money for rent after losing yet another job, I wired him $500. When his girlfriend broke up with him, and he asked to stay with me for a few weeks, I said yes, even though I barely had room for myself in my one-bedroom apartment. Each time, my parents assured me it was just temporary. "He just needs a little support, Melissa. You're his sister." Family helps family. That line, "family helps family," was their go-to. It didn't matter how many times Jake screwed up or how much I sacrificed to clean up his messes. They expected me to step in because that's what family does. And every time I did, I told myself it was the last time. But the truth was, I was scared to say no. Deep down, I still craved their approval. I thought that maybe, if I kept helping, they would finally see how much I had done for them. Maybe they would appreciate me the way they adored Jake. Maybe they would realize that I wasn't just the dependable one. I was the one holding everything together. That hope kept me going, even as my own life became more demanding. By my late 20s, I had climbed the ranks at my tech company and was finally earning enough to feel stable. I bought my first car, a used sedan that felt like a luxury after years of relying on buses and trains. A few years later, I put a down payment on a modest house in Seattle. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, a symbol of everything I had worked for. When I told my parents about the house, they barely reacted. My mom changed the subject to Jake's new girlfriend, a woman he had met online. My dad joked that it was about time I settled down, as though buying a house wasn't an achievement worth celebrating. I brushed it off, but the sting lingered. No matter what I did, it was never enough. Meanwhile, Jake was still bouncing from one failed job to another, each time blaming his bosses or coworkers for his inability to succeed. He had started dabbling in risky investments, convinced he could make a quick fortune in cryptocurrency. Predictably, he lost everything within weeks. When he called me asking for help, I gave him the same advice I always did. Take responsibility for your actions. He didn't like that answer. Neither did my parents. Why can't you just help your brother? My mom asked during one of her rare calls. You're doing so well, Melissa. It's not like you can't afford it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her that everything I had was the result of my hard work, not theirs. But instead, I stayed silent. As always, I let the guilt win. But something was starting to shift. For the first time, I began to wonder if the price of keeping the peace was too high. How much longer could I sacrifice my own happiness for a family that never appreciated me? How much more was I willing to give before I finally reached my breaking point? It was a chilly February evening when my phone buzzed with an incoming call from my mom. She rarely called me unless there was a crisis, so I instinctively braced myself. Sure enough, the moment I answered, I could hear the strained cheerfulness in her voice. It was the kind of overly pleasant tone she used when she wanted something. How's work, Melissa? Still with that software company? She asked. Her questions were so generic, they might as well have been pulled from a script. Yes, Mom. Same job, same company, I replied, already tired of the conversation. That's wonderful. And how's your boyfriend? She continued, as if she hadn't already forgotten his name the last time we spoke. I'm single, Mom. You know that. We broke up over a year ago. Oh, right. I must have mixed that up. And your apartment? Still liking it? I don't live in an apartment. I bought a house 2 years ago. There was a pause. For a moment, I thought she might finally realize how little she knew about my life. But instead, she plowed ahead, her voice dropping into a familiar mix of concern and guilt. Melissa, I hate to ask you this, but it's about Jake. He's in a bit of trouble. Of course, it was about Jake. It was always about Jake. What kind of trouble? I asked, already dreading the answer. Well, he's borrowed some money. About $30,000. And the people he borrowed it from aren't the friendliest types. They've started demanding repayment, and he's struggling. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. $30,000? Who even lends that kind of money to someone like Jake? How on earth did he rack up that kind of debt? I asked, half expecting a ridiculous explanation involving another failed business venture or a cryptocurrency scam. That doesn't matter right now, my mom said dismissively. What matters is that he's your brother, and he needs your help. Family helps family, Melissa. We've always taught you that. I almost laughed at the absurdity of her words. Family helps family? That was their mantra every time they needed me to bail Jake out of another mess. It was never about helping me, never about supporting my efforts. It was always about cleaning up after him. I'm sorry, Mom, but I can't do it. I can't help him this time, I said, my voice firm. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then, like a switch flipping, her tone turned icy. You're being selfish, she snapped. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? Your father and I sacrificed so much for you, Melissa. And now, when your brother needs you the most, you're turning your back on him? Do you want his blood on your hands if something happens? Her words were like daggers, each one sharper than the last. But this time, I didn't let them cut too deep. I had spent years being the responsible one, the problem solver, the fixer, and where had it gotten me? A lifetime of unappreciated sacrifices and a family that saw me as nothing more than a safety net for Jake's reckless behavior. "No, Mom. I'm not doing it," I said before ending the call. The moment I hung up, I felt a mix of emotions. Relief that I had finally stood my ground. Guilt for saying no to my family. Fear of what might come next. I sat in my home office, staring at the phone, half expecting another call. But it didn't come, at least, not right away. The fallout began a few days later. My phone lit up with texts from my mom, all variations of the same theme. How could I be so heartless? Didn't I care about my brother's well-being? My dad, usually the quieter of the two, sent an email. His words were colder, more calculated. He accused me of abandoning the family, of forgetting where I came from. And then came the bank alert. It was a Tuesday morning when I got the call from my bank's fraud department. Someone had tried to access my account using my personal information. They had my social security number, my mother's maiden name, even the name of my childhood pet. The security team flagged the attempt as suspicious and blocked it before any money could be transferred. I felt sick to my stomach. The only person who could have known all that information was Jake. I changed every password, updated my security questions, and set up additional safeguards on all my accounts. But the damage was already done. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was betrayal on a level I hadn't thought possible. A few days later, I got a call from my aunt, one of the few family members I still trusted. She had heard through the grapevine that Jake was telling everyone I was refusing to help him, painting me as some cold, selfish sister hoarding my wealth while he struggled. "That's not all," she said. "Jake's been borrowing money from other family members, too. Grandma, Uncle Mike, even your cousin Sarah. Each time, he's given a different story about why he needs it. I think his debts are much worse than you realize." I thanked her for telling me, even though it only added to my growing sense of unease. This wasn't just a family problem anymore. It was a ticking time bomb. But the final blow came a week later, when I decided to confront Jake face to face. I showed up at his dingy apartment unannounced, determined to get answers. He looked disheveled, his eyes bloodshot and his clothes wrinkled. "Melissa, took you long enough," he said as he opened the door. "Cut the crap, Jake. Did you try to hack into my bank account?" He didn't even try to deny it. "Mom and Dad said if things got bad enough, you cave." "I was just speeding things up," he said, as if it were the most logical thing in the world. I stared at him, stunned. This was my brother. The same kid I had looked after, protected, and supported for years. And he didn't even see what he had done as wrong. "Do you even understand what you've done?" I asked, my voice shaking with anger. "Relax. It's not like I actually took anything. Besides, you've got plenty. What's the big deal?" The big deal? The big deal was that he had crossed a line I couldn't ignore. And as much as it hurt, I knew this wasn't just about Jake anymore. It was about me, my future, and my right to protect what I had worked so hard to build. After leaving Jake's apartment, I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind raced with a torrent of emotions: anger, disappointment, sadness. But above all, I felt betrayed. Not just by Jake, but by my parents, who had enabled him every step of the way. I drove home in silence, the reality of the situation sinking in with every mile. Jake wasn't just irresponsible, he was dangerous. He had no qualms about crossing ethical lines, even if it meant stealing from his own sister. And my parents? They had the audacity to justify his actions, calling his attempt to hack into my bank account a desperate mistake. That night, I started taking precautions. I reached out to my company's IT security team and explained the situation. They walked me through steps to secure my devices and online accounts. I also installed a high-grade security system in my home, complete with cameras and motion sensors. Paranoia? Maybe. But after what Jake had done, I wasn't willing to take any chances. The next morning, I received a call from my aunt, Catherine. She was one of the few family members I still trusted, and her voice was heavy with concern. "Melissa, we need to talk," she said. "What's going on?" I asked, dreading her response. It's your parents. They've been telling everyone that you've abandoned Jake in his time of need. They're making you out to be some heartless sister who refuses to help her struggling brother. I shouldn't have been surprised, but it still stung. Great. What else is new? I said bitterly. There's more, she continued. Jake's been going around to other family members, asking for money. He told Grandma he needed it for medical bills. He told Uncle Steve it was for a business opportunity. And he told me it was for rent. None of it adds up. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and the picture was uglier than I'd imagined. Jake wasn't just irresponsible. He was manipulative, spinning different stories to get what he wanted. Thank you for telling me, Aunt Catherine. I'll handle this, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure how. Later that week, I received an email from my dad, the first direct communication from him since I had refused to help Jake. It was short, cold, and to the point. Your actions have left us no choice but to reconsider your place in this family. We have always supported you, provided for you, and given you every opportunity to succeed. If you continue to abandon your brother, there will be consequences. Think carefully about your next move. I stared at the email, a mix of disbelief and anger bubbling up inside me. The audacity of them to claim they had supported me when they hadn't contributed a dime to my education or living expenses. The idea that my success was somehow a product of their sacrifices was laughable. But the warning at the end of the email sent a chill down my spine. Consequences? What did that even mean? I forwarded the email to my lawyer and asked for advice. She recommended documenting everything, every text, email, and voicemail, as a precaution. I also decided to send an email to my extended family, setting the record straight. In it, I explained what had been happening, Jake's mounting debts, his attempt to access my bank account, and my parents' refusal to hold him accountable. I included screenshots of threatening messages and a transcript of my last conversation with Jake. I wasn't trying to stir up drama. I just couldn't stand the thought of my name being dragged through the mud while the truth remained hidden. The fallout was immediate. Relatives I hadn't heard from in years reached out, sharing their own experiences with Jake. My cousin, Rachel, said he had borrowed $2,000 from her to pay off car repairs and never paid her back. Uncle Mike revealed that Jake had used his identity to open a credit card. Even Grandma, the sweetest woman I know, admitted that Jake had taken $500 from her purse during a visit and claimed he'd borrowed it. It was worse than I'd imagined. The tipping point came when Jake's current roommate contacted me after seeing my email. He told me that Jake had been acting strangely, making cryptic comments about teaching people lessons and getting what's his. The roommate had also found suspicious credit card statements in Jake's room, accounts that weren't in Jake's name. I forwarded all this information to my lawyer and discussed filing a restraining order. At this point, it wasn't just about money. It was about safety. But the most shocking revelation came a few days later when Aunt Catherine called me again. "Melissa, you're not going to believe this," she said. "Jake's ex-roommate reached out to me. He says Jake stole his identity and opened several lines of credit in his name. He's been too ashamed to come forward, but after seeing your email, he's willing to talk." The weight of it all hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just a family feud anymore. Jake's actions were criminal, and my parents had been complicit in covering them up. That weekend, I met with my lawyer to discuss next steps. She advised me to go to the police with the evidence I had gathered. It wasn't an easy decision. I knew it would fracture my family beyond repair, but I also knew I couldn't stay silent. As I sat in the police station, filing a report against my own brother, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time, I was standing up for myself, refusing to be dragged down by Jake's bad decisions and my parents' toxic enabling. It wasn't just about protecting myself anymore. It was about drawing a line in the sand and saying, "No more." The aftermath of my email to the family and my report to the police unfolded faster than I could have imagined. By the end of the week, the family group chat was buzzing with messages from relatives who had finally seen Jake's true colors. For years, I had been painted as the distant, ungrateful daughter who refused to help her struggling brother. But now, the truth was out, and people were angry. At Jake, at my parents, and at themselves for falling for his lies. Uncle Mike shared how Jake had maxed out a credit card he'd co-signed on, leaving him with thousands of dollars in debt. Cousin Rachel admitted she had been too embarrassed to speak up when Jake failed to repay a loan. Even Aunt Catherine, my steadfast ally, revealed that Jake had asked her for money under the guise of needing to pay off some medical bills. Each new story only added to the mountain of evidence against him. But the most damning revelation came from Jake's current roommate, who contacted me after hearing about my email. He had no idea of Jake's financial schemes when they first moved in together, but after finding suspicious documents, credit card statements with names he didn't recognize, he realized something was wrong. He was furious and evicted Jake within a week. My parents, on the other hand, doubled down. They refused to believe Jake was capable of such deceit and insisted that everyone was blowing things out of proportion. My mom, ever the master of guilt, even called me in a last-ditch effort to salvage her narrative. "Melissa, this has gone too far," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're tearing this family apart. Do you really want that on your conscience?" "No, Mom," I replied, calm but firm. "I'm not tearing the family apart. I'm just refusing to keep enabling Jake." "That's on you." I hung up before she could respond. The fallout hit my parents hard. For years, they had maintained a carefully crafted image as the perfect, supportive family. My dad was known as the strong, silent provider, and my mom was the doting mother who could do no wrong. But now, their friends and community members were seeing through the facade. Their social circle began to shrink. My mom's friends from church stopped inviting her to gatherings. My dad's golfing buddies suddenly became too busy for their weekly games. Even my parents' closest friends started to distance themselves, unwilling to align with their defense of Jake's behavior. As for Jake, the consequences of his actions finally caught up to him. The police took my report seriously, especially after hearing from his ex-roommate and reviewing the evidence I provided. While the investigation was ongoing, Jake found himself unable to escape the damage he had done. His credit was ruined, his reputation shattered, and he was forced to take on multiple low-paying jobs just to scrape by. For the first time in his life, Jake had to face the consequences of his choices. Meanwhile, I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced in years. With my parents and Jake out of my life, I could finally focus on myself, my career, my friendships, and my own well-being. My job was thriving. I had recently applied for a promotion, and without the constant stress of family drama weighing me down, I was able to give it my all. When I got the call from my boss saying I'd been selected for the role, I almost cried. It was a validation of everything I had worked so hard for. In my personal life, things were looking up too. I started dating someone who respected my boundaries and valued my independence. It was refreshing to be with someone who didn't try to manipulate me or guilt me into doing things I didn't want to do. As for my extended family, many of them reached out to apologize for believing my parents' version of events for so long. While I appreciated their support, I made it clear that I wasn't interested in rekindling relationships with anyone who had contributed to the toxic dynamics of the past. I also took additional steps to protect myself. I worked with my lawyer to implement stronger security measures, both online and in my personal life. I installed security cameras at my house, updated all my passwords, and set up a monitoring system for any suspicious activity on my financial accounts. The most surprising change, though, came from within. For years, I had carried the weight of my family's expectations, guilt, and manipulation. Saying no to them, exposing the truth, and standing my ground had been one of the hardest things I'd ever done. But it was also the most liberating. I realized that I didn't need their approval to be happy. I didn't need to prove myself to people who couldn't see my worth. I had built a life I was proud of, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. Not Jake, not my parents, and not anyone else. In the weeks that followed, my parents stopped trying to contact me. No more guilt-tripping calls or emails. No more manipulative texts. It was as if they finally understood that I was done playing their game. Jake, too, stayed out of my life. I heard through the grapevine that he was struggling to pay off his debts and had burned bridges with nearly everyone in the family. Part of me felt sorry for him, but I knew that helping him again would only enable his behavior. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free. This wasn't the ending I had imagined, but it was the one I needed. Letting go of my family wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I no longer felt like the scapegoat or the fixer. I was just Melissa, a woman who had worked hard, overcome obstacles, and finally reclaimed her life. As I move forward, I'm focusing on building my own version of family, a network of people who value integrity, accountability, and genuine care for one another. It's a new chapter, and for the first time, it feels like I'm writing my own story.